Remain standing for the pledge. Get everybody back in. Please join me in the pledge. Oh, we've got a couple more. All right, please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I got the short chair.
Yeah, this one's high now.
All right, welcome to our new members. Welcome to all the people who got sworn in, and we only have one item on the agenda, and discussion regarding the state third grade literacy requirements. Mr. Langford, come on down.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer. Just wanted, we had some questions and ideas and thoughts put out over the last few weeks, and so wanted to take just a few minutes and share with you not just about the third grade retention law, but also just kind of an overview of how we got to where we are with standards, with TN Ready, the assessment, and then how that looks moving forward for third grade assessment. So feel free, as always, if you have any questions or anything, just jump in and we can stop right there and chat if you have any questions or thoughts. This is actually a Madison Creek classroom, fourth grade classroom in Madison Creek. Okay, so Tennessee in 2007, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce did a report, and they found that, or they gave Tennessee an F for truth in advertising because state assessment scores were in the 90 percentile on just about everything, and only 25% of Tennessee students were passing national college and career readiness tests. And so as a result of that, began a little bit with the Bredesen administration, but absolutely with the Haslam administration was what can we do to raise Tennessee academic performance? The teaching kids to read is probably, or it is the most important thing we do. And so how do we set standards? How do we set goals? How do we raise expectations? And how do we provide the support to do those things? So Tennessee committed to raise those expectations in the late 2000s, or 2008, 2009, 2010. The Tennessee Diploma Project reworked expectations for high school. If you look at our high schools now, in Sumner County, you have 26 credits, 4 years of math, 4 years of English, a number of other classes, personal finance. It lays out a course of study that prepares students for what comes next. Also, a big investment that I think has been good in Sumner County is accepting that not everyone should go to a four-year university, but there are a number of alternatives for kids to pursue. And the thing is, we had said that for a long time, but nobody really did the back-end support to build it out. And that's taken place over the last 10 or 15 years. So you've seen partnerships with TCATs, with community colleges. Tennessee Promise makes that free for students for 2 years. Honestly, the thing that we're trying to think through now is how do we get kids in the right place? The great thing is we've got the ability for kids to go debt-free for 2 years to a community college or a TCAT program. A big part of moving and correcting the truth in advertising charge from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was making Tennessee state standards more rigorous and aligning those for success on the ACT. The ACT is still the gold standard, especially in the South. There's the ACT and the SAT, but that's kind of the measuring mark, not just for colleges, but like if you want to work at, I think it's the Volkswagen plant outside Chattanooga, to get into their programming, you have to have a 24 on the ACT because they need people that are technologically sophisticated to be able to operate the equipment, operate the machines, and to learn at a high rate. So TN Ready was designed to measure how prepared students are for college and career. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, now the Tennessee Ready is not part of ACT. Tennessee wanted its own test to assess its own standards. So TN Ready was developed to do that. But the goal is to have an assessment platform that prepares students to take the ACT. The ACT determines college readiness to be an 18 on the English ACT. The English part of the ACT is a lot of usage and grammar. 20 if you take the optional writing part of the ACT, 22 on reading, and 23 on science. Those are the benchmarks that deem student ready for college. What the ACT means by that is that you're 75%, there's a 75% probability that you make a C in an equivalent college course, 50% chance that you would make a B or higher. So the goal is to give students the knowledge and the background and the ability to master the skills necessary to be successful in college, but also in career. You'll see a little bit later, there's a heavy emphasis now on informational text. It's one thing to be able to read a novel. It's another thing to be able to read a manual that you might use to operate a bulldozer or something like that. There's definitely different skill sets involved in reading different types of materials. So just to give you kind of an overview of what the third grade TN Ready assessment looks like, the first part is writing. It's 80 minutes. Then the other three parts are multiple choice, and they are 30, 40, and 30 for a total of 180 minutes. Typically that takes place on more than one day. Schools have some discretion in how they set up their testing calendars. Some will combine, like section 2 and 3 in one day, but some will use 4 days. Most use at least 3 to cover these TN Ready assessments. Okay, so the breakdown is about 32 to 34% literature, 32 to 34% informational text. That's nonfiction. There are a lot of scientific readings here to give kids exposure and background to informational text outside of just fiction. Like I think when we were growing up, we typically had an English class where we diagrammed sentences, and then we had a literature class where we read mostly fiction. All right, vocabulary and conventions are in there 13 to 18%, 13 to 14%, and then 2 to 4% written expressions. This is an example of a third grade TN Ready question. So this is a short passage. Some of the passages in the test would be 2 or 3 pages, and then they would have 4 or 5 questions. Some of the questions will have more than one correct answer that they have to choose, but this is what our third graders would typically see on a TN Ready assessment. Something like this. Okay, so when you get a TN Ready score report, 4 is exceed standards, 3 meet standards, 2 is approaching, and 1 is below. We'll come back to that in just a minute. I wanted to run through a couple other things. If you've been reading the news lately, the NAEP is a national test that's given every year across the country, and it tries to give you a way to compare how students are doing across the country. And one of the things that they found, one of the great things of Sumner County, and we've celebrated this a lot, is that we stayed in school during COVID. We missed that initial 9 weeks in the spring of 2020, but then after that, the first year back, we were in school, elementary 92% of the time, middle and high 87% of the time. Last year we had almost no disruptions. I mean, we had disruptions, in the building due to testing and quarantining and things like that, but no, we stayed in school. Unfortunately, across the country, we had districts that were out of school 18 to 24 months. Or did completely virtual, and so you can see like the terrifying part of this is that 2 decades of academic growth was lost in 2 years, and if you go down into the subgroups, it hits even harder for economically disadvantaged students and students of color. So that's the national picture. You may see that a lot because it's been a pretty hot topic the last week or two on television and news and online. But here is Sumner County. So our third grade scores in 2019 were 46%, 2022 44.8. We've just about erased the learning loss in third grade, but if you look, the state average was 36% in 2019 and 35% last year, or the previous year. Fourth grade, 44% in 2019, 52.7% in 2022, about almost 14 points higher than the state average. 46% in 2019 and 53% in 2022. We're usually in the top, quintile of districts in the state, and definitely among the large districts, we're usually in the top 2 or 3. What that means for us, I wanted to kind of give you the context of understanding, like, our test is meant not to give a false picture of where our kids are by putting scores up in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It's to be more closely aligned. Like our seniors last year, or year before last, finished about 50% college and career ready on the ACT benchmark. So we're pretty close. It just shows that we're pretty closely aligned to where the ACT would project our students. Yes, Mr. Daniels?
Hey, just one quick question. So the 2022 results with the third graders, that would be the group that would have been in first grade when COVID hit, lost the last semester, and then had on and off learning or possibly virtually the following year, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Well, and I think what you'll see in those numbers too is, we've had somewhere around, I haven't seen the numbers for this year, but last year we had about 1,100 kids move in by August from other states or other districts. So what we have is our kids that have been in school the whole time, but then we have a lot of kids that have come, some missed 6 months, some missed 12 months, some missed 18 months. Some are from states that have similarly rigorous standards. Others come already behind Tennessee schools or students. So it's a little bit of a challenge for teachers. It'll take a couple years to sort out because our kids are kind of all over the place. I think it's important, though, for us to say, I've seen other districts do this, and they talk about, well, the kids that came to us, well, they're all our kids. We want to make sure that we've got things in place to benefit all of our students. At the same time this is going on, we've gone from August 2021, we had 1,050 EL students, English language learners. We have 1,450 currently. So, we've managed to stay the same or improve from 2019 pre-COVID while having a lot of other factors at play, which is a real testament to our teachers and the work that they've done and the groundwork that's been laid as we move forward. But I wanted you to understand, because if you first look at these numbers, just see it within the context that our test is meant to prepare our kids for college career readiness assessments like the ACT, and not just give us, like in 2007, a false positive so we feel good. Sometimes you'll see achievement tests from other states, and then when we try to place kids, we find out they're behind where ours are because of just the nature of those tests. Yes, Mr. Wise.
Mr. Langford, thank you. Do you recall, I know a couple of years ago we talked about it a little bit. Do you recall how many different languages are spoken in Sumner County schools?
Mr. Daniels asked me that last month, and I meant to find that out, and I have not found that out yet. I can tell you just from recent interactions with people in buildings, we've got Ukrainian, Russian, I'm not sure the name of the language in Egypt, Arabic, but variations in local dialects, French, Spanish. I would say probably ballpark 25 to 30 at least, maybe more. But I know like Norma's team is looking for, we have translation services in Spanish. We're passable in French. But when you get beyond that, it's hard, and we're getting more and more like Farsi or different things like that. So it's a real, the good thing about EL is it's not just built, a lot of times we think that EL is built around teaching Spanish-speaking students how to read in English, but it's really a lot broader than that. Honestly, when we get into some of the fundamentals of how you teach kids to read, it's really the same for students that are learning English for the first time. They just have the extra challenge of not having it spoken at home a lot of times, and that adds some to the problem, or to the challenge.
Mr. Langford, Mr. Lancaster has a question.
So,
Hang on one second. Good.
third grade is the first year that these students are exposed to this test. That's correct, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the other question, why I'm noticing on this comparison, so third grade, we went from a 46% in 2019 to a 44.8. We expect to drop due to COVID. Why would you think fourth and fifth grade, we saw significant increases, improvements from pre-COVID to?
I would say because we've aligned everything.
Okay.
Before, especially I'll talk about foundational literacy in a little bit. I think that's the driving force, or, phonics. It's a little bit bigger than just phonics, but getting everybody in the district kind of doing the same thing so that when you drop into a classroom, it's a lot easier to support teachers. When you have challenges like, that COVID brought, before when you had everybody kind of developing their own lessons, it was hard to support to scale because everybody was doing something different. It made it easier, if you remember back even in the 9 weeks of 2020, our schools were able to set up book drop-offs because it was easier for parents just to come in and grab books and then because we were all kind of doing the same or similar things. It's a little harder when that's widespread and kind of spread out all over everything. I think, but all that aside, the biggest thing is our teachers have worked, being in school helped, and our teachers have worked tirelessly, and they've worked in a focused direction. But I think they've really, one of the things, I'll talk about foundations in a little bit, it's the foundational literacy program that we use. Our teachers love it. Our kids love it. If you go in a classroom, you'll see the owl, as they used to point out the letter sounds. And I mean, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but somewhere for about 30 years in American education, we got way off track in how to teach kids to read. But those would be some of the, if we can, Mr. Lancaster, if we can hold and then come back to it and see if I answer it in a couple slides, because I think that's a very valid question that we need to look at.
Ms. Andrews?
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that in looking at those numbers of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're looking at the third grade from 2019, then those kids, the fifth grade kids in 2022 were actually in second grade. So if you look, the numbers going down, you kind of have to go backwards because it's not the same kids year over year. So
Right.
It's the third grade kids in 2019. In 2022, were actually sixth graders.
Yeah, but
Right,
I think
so-
he was saying the kids that are third graders were first graders.
Right, that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. So when you're looking at it going down, they were in first grade, so that, like you're talking about the foundational literacy part that is so instrumental in creating the foundation to their reading, they missed part of that. So it's not, so that's where I think we see that dip, because if you look at the other grades, they actually went up.
Well, and I think, the challenges that the challenges at each grade band are pretty, it's hard to wrap it's different at each grade band. For instance, in high school, the loss of content knowledge in that 9 weeks was substantial in classes like geometry and advanced math and things like that. You'll hear this if you talk to college kids that are like, one of my daughter's best friends is an engineering major, and he feels ill-prepared to go out into the job force. He's actually doing a master's degree because he feels like he missed so much at college that he didn't have the content knowledge. So in high school, it's been more of a content problem. In elementary school, what we're still seeing is, the kids that are kindergartners now were 2-year-old, 2 or 3 when COVID began. And so, they didn't have the same opportunities for Sunday school, Mother's Day out, preschool, daycare. Their social skills, it's not that they have social or anxiety problems, it's that they haven't had the opportunity, whereas like a high school kid missed half a semester of geometry, our youngest children are having to also learn, some things that typically our kindergartners have come into Sumner County schools with, and that's just going to take a couple of years to, I think if you talk to any of our principals, they'll tell you that this year started more smoothly, obviously, than the previous 2, but it's starting to come back in, but it's going to take a couple of years because you're still going to have a couple, I saw a statistic that said the class of 2032, I think, will be the first one to not have been impacted by COVID, which is, there's some short-term issues, long-term issues, but, I think, but the biggest thing is our teachers, honestly, from the first moment in 2020, our teachers have really, principals have worked tirelessly to make sure that our kids have gotten what they need to be successful. All right, so what have we done? And Mr. Lancaster, I think this is going to that. Excellent teachers, coaches, and principals. We're blessed in Sumner County to have outstanding teachers at each school. I wish I could, we could celebrate publicly the reward schools, but we can't. It's still embargoed. It's the longest embargo since the Cuban Missile Crisis, it feels like. But we have excellent teachers, coaches, and principals. Foundational literacy. So depending on your age, you learn how to read through phonics. We sounded out words. We learned to decode words. Then somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s, we went away from it and we went to something that looked like this. In elementary school, we taught kids how to read by using the worst possible strategy to teach kids how to read, which is look at the picture and guess. So every picture in a book had something like on the left-hand side, you can see that the dog is running up the hill. So if you hit a word you didn't understand, the teacher would say, well, look at the picture and figure it out. And then, of course, on the other side, the fox is running down the other side towards the river. The problem becomes is if you learn how to read this way, at some point we take the pictures out of books. and then it becomes really hard. About 35 to 37% of kids can learn to read just from family exposure, reading at home, things like that. When you use this approach to reading, about 35 to 37% of kids learn how to read this way. So honestly, you're really not making that big of an imprint on kids and their ability to read. You have to go, like, foundational literacy is not hard, it's just hard work. But if you go into a class, like I was in Whitten last year, we went to a kindergarten class to watch their foundations lesson, and the kids were absolutely rocking it. Like, the teacher just sat back and let the kids teach it, but they're going through, like, we do this now between kindergarten and third grade, and what we see our kids doing is, it's not anything revolutionary. They're sounding out letters, they're learning their sounds, they're learning how vowels and consonants move together. If you talk to any of those kids now, they know way more about this process than adults do. And definitely, like, if their parents came up during that time when we learned the other way, they absolutely know more. You'll start to see spelling improve. I heard someone say the other day that their second grader spells better than their seventh grader. That's because they've had a lot more exposure to this. A decodable reader is a book where the pictures don't connect to the words, and you actually have to look at the word and sound it out. And that's how you learn how to read, is practicing that over and over and over again. So if you've read broadly, an economically disadvantaged student typically comes into a school having seen about 5 million or heard about 5 million less words than a child from a non-economically disadvantaged home. So nationwide, when you pursue these reading strategies that don't connect with the science of reading and what works to teach kids to read, you're doing a great disservice to those kids, because they're already, like, vocabulary building is one of the biggest things that you need to be able to read and to progress towards college and career readiness, and that's something that we have to hit really hard. Something else that we're doing is 3 times a year we do a screener and communicate those results to parents, just to let parents know where their students are in terms of reading. It should never be a surprise if your child is struggling with reading. And alignment of interventions, Mr. Lancaster, you mentioned the success earlier. Before, we were doing a whole lot of different interventions to try to, like, our hearts have always been in the right place to try to help kids to read. But what you would see a lot of times is you go in a classroom, and during the intervention time, a teacher would have 4 or 5 kids at the front of the room, and the other kids would have little baskets of books that they would practice reading. Well, the thing is like, it depended solely on the skill of the teacher and the work that he or she did to provide that intervention. Now what we use Foundations. That's our main foundational literacy curriculum piece. But then we use Wilson Reading System all the way up. So, and part of it is when kids are going to the intervention, they're hearing the same language and the same routines and procedures, rather than doing something in class and then going to an intervention time and having to learn a wholly different language. So that's part of the alignment thing. Frankie and Jean shared a couple weeks ago about Summer Scholars. We had over 2,600 kids that were in our Summer Scholars programming in the month of June. The intent of that was to give kids time to recover lost learning in math and English with an emphasis on STEM. And so we were up about 1,000 from the first year to last year. And then tutoring. I meant to pull the statistic. We had, I think, 278 tutors last year tutoring across the county. We do that a little bit differently. We do tutoring in elementary school. We try to get the ratio. The research shows the ideal ratio is 4 to 1. That's a little hard to hit, but we try to keep it no more than 6. We try to keep between 4 and 6 in elementary school to really focus that time 1-on-1 or 2-on-1 or 3-on-1, 4-on-1 with the teacher. And then as they move up, we still want to do that some, but then sometimes what we see in middle school and high school is a child is absent, or they have a surgery, or they go out of town or something like that. They don't necessarily need a whole semester of tutoring. They need like 2 or 3 days to get with the teacher and learn and catch up on what they missed. Or just if they're missing work or get behind or they're struggling, then we can do that. So we approach it a little bit differently in middle school and high school, just to try to hit and mirror the needs of our kids. Okay, so now to the 3rd grade literacy law. So approaching students. So if we go back, approaching is right under what the state deems meets the standards or proficient. So if a third grader scores in that 2 level, and they're not an English learner with less than 2 years of ELA instruction, or they haven't been previously retrained, or they don't retest. Now, that would be the school giving a similar type test and scoring it according to the state standards, just like they retook the TN Ready. We've not received any guidance on how that process would work or what test we would use. Basically, our kids would be looking at 2 choices. Summer scholars, where they would need to attend 90% of the time and show adequate progress on a test given at the end of the summer, or participate in 2 30-minute tutoring sessions per week for their entire 4th grade year with a tutor to teacher ratio or student to tutor ratio of 3 to 1. Okay, so that's if they're a 2. Now, if they're a 1, if they score below, they have to do the summer scholars and the tutoring. So I can give you some ballpark numbers. In Tennessee last year, there were 73,962 third graders that tested in the state. 48,075. If you saw earlier, only 35% of Tennessee third graders scored or met or exceeded standards. So you're talking roughly about 26,000 students statewide, 26,626 students statewide that would have to do one or the other, and another 21,449 statewide that would have to do both. So the numbers are kind of staggering, which leads us in, I know when I've talked to several of you, there are a lot of concerns. Here are just some initial concerns from studying this. Requiring students to attend summer scholars. We, over the last 2 years, have committed to making summer scholars optional or voluntary for the student so that they want to be there. Now, it's been high energy, and our kids have loved it, our elementary especially. Middle school kids don't get quite so fired up to do an extra month of school in the summer, but elementary kids have really enjoyed it. We've had high elementary attendance and very positive parent feedback. Another concern would be staffing summer scholars. We would have a little over 1,200 kids total that would have to pick one of the 2 options or both. But 48,000 students statewide would qualify for the summer programming and or tutoring. The number of tutors needed to meet that 3 to 1 ratio, just for that level 4, the below group, that would be about 7,000 tutors that would be needed statewide to meet that
Mr.
ratio.
Langford, we got 2 lights on.
Oh,
I didn't
sorry.
see which one came
I-
first.
I-
I'll say Andy.
Yeah, I've just got a quick question. So when you said 1,200 students in our county, you're just talking third graders.
Right.
I just wanted to point that out. It's not
Yes.
across the system 1,200. This is just third graders and doesn't include all the other students in our county that may want to attend the summer scholars or need it for another subject.
Right. To give you an idea of the scale, we had 2,600 total students in summer scholars last summer. This would be about 1,200 third graders.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Ms. Andrews?
Just curious, out of the number of summer scholars that we had this past year, have we done crunched the numbers to see of those how many would fall into this category, or how many of those were already meeting standards or exceeding them?
Well, the numbers I just shared are from this past year.
Right, but specifically of those students
Oh, to
in
see.
Sumner Scholars, because I know a lot of
Right.
times, it's a win-win for parents, especially in elementary school, to have Summer Scholars, especially if, it's a 2-parent
Yeah.
working household. It's a great place for their kids to go. They, are fed, they're learning, and so forth. But sometimes in those situations, those are students who are already meeting expectations. It's more of
Right.
an enrichment than it is intervention. So do we have numbers on how many of the kids that attended Summer Scholars actually were there for specifically because they needed intervention?
We don't. We have the number of economically disadvantaged students that participate because that's how the summer programming is funded that way, and so we have to meet a minimum number of economically disadvantaged students participating, and then we're free to open it up to everybody. We've been fortunate in the sense that the money that we received from the state was enough that we could really just take every child that wanted to come. Part of it is that we run our summer camps in June. We don't get our TN Ready scores until mid-July. So, what we will look at in terms of identifying students, because the other thing that the law says is we have to identify students that are possibly on the retention path. We have to, by law, we have to identify them by February 1st. So we do in elementary and middle school, we do 2 benchmarks a year, and we will use, not as an ironclad thing, but it's good to have that our benchmark data is about 93% aligned with TN Ready. So we kind of use that so we can plan and recruit, because we do encourage students that we think it'll benefit to attend summer scholars.
Thank you. Ms. Andrews, Mr. Lancaster?
Okay, the summer scholars that we have currently, it's not at every school, correct? We only
Right.
have it at select schools.
We've tried to rotate it because, just in terms of building wear and tear,
Right.
and we try to hit central locations that are accessible for parents to drop off children, but also for our buses. So,
But if this goes into fruition like it seems to be, we would basically probably have to be at every school, correct?
every school, and in addition to just the teachers, every school site that you open, we have to have a nurse, we have to have secretarial staff. I mean, we don't have to, we need to have to support our kids, custodial, office, administration. There's a huge back end to support when we're moving that many kids.
And these students also have to be transported. We have to provide busing and all as well.
Mhm.
So you got that in addition to everything else
Right.
to consider.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. Mr. King?
Yeah, so that 1,200 number that you gave, you said there were 1,200 students
Mhm.
approximately that this law would affect. Is that excluding English language learners, students with disabilities, or is that including them?
That's including them.
That's including them.
Right.
Okay, so it's my understanding this law would not affect the English language learners or students with disabilities. Is that correct? So the total number of students would actually be less than 1,200.
It would be less than 1,200, but it would
Okay.
be EL students that haven't had 2 years of ELA.
Okay.
If they've had over 2 years of ELA instruction, then they would fall into the same camp as all other students. And then I believe, Norma, it would be
I
an
think it's
IEP
on a,
decision.
yeah, it's still on, it would be a case-by-case basis on the students with IEPs. You wouldn't make a blanket statement that anybody with an IEP, this doesn't apply to. You have to kind of look at, does the disability cause the reading problem?
Okay.
Because there's some disabilities that have nothing to do with reading.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, but I mean, I think so. You could probably, best case scenario, you might take 50 to 75 off that number.
Okay.
King, if you turn your light off there. Thank you.
All right, so that is, I think the biggest thing is, if you look at our data and how our kids are improving, we still have, we're happy that we're where we are, but we're not satisfied with where we are. We want to continue to move. There's certainly a lot of things that we can do better, but we feel like we're starting our 3rd year with Foundations in K2. This is our 2nd year with it in 3rd grade. We're seeing a lot of growth with our kids learning phonics and learning how to sound out words and things like that. We're seeing a lot of growth there, and that combined with everything else that we're doing, it kind of helps it helps those kids move. And then having the aligned interventions with the Wilson Reading System, the other things that we're doing, it really gives us tools, because the thing that because we're focusing on 3rd grade, one of the hardest things that we're seeing is since we're getting a lot of kids moving in from other places, is kids that are coming in middle school or high school, and they have substantial gaps in their learning, and trying to help them. The Wilson and some of the other tools that we have lets us have something for middle school and high school teachers, because this law, another part of this law, requires colleges to teach all elementary teachers have to come out with a foundational literacy course. They have to know how to teach foundational literacy when they become teachers. The same is not true for middle school and high school teachers. So the thing is, middle school and high school teachers, we're just starting to address the needs of teaching how to teach literacy. If you've ever, I was a high school English teacher. If you walk into a kindergarten classroom the first semester of school when they're teaching kids how to read, it's the closest thing to magic that I can imagine. Like it's just unbelievable to watch. But our middle school and high school teachers have not been trained or expected to do that. So having the resources and the materials and reading interventionists to be able to do that is a huge thing for our schools.
Ms. Hawkins?
Yes, it seems to have been the understanding that if a 3rd grader failed this test, that they would have been retained. That seems to be the word on the street. I don't see that here. Help me understand how that works. Is there a holding back of a third grader who doesn't pass the test?
If they don't meet these criteria.
So a third grader does not meet the level to go on without any kind of intervention. The choices are take the summer scholars or the tutoring the next year. But there's not a point in time at the end of third grade where they take a test, do not achieve how they're supposed to, and they are told, well, you have to stay in third grade for another year.
Yes, if you don't complete one of those options, like as Mr. King mentioned, it's important to keep out there special ed and EL students. There is a little bit of a different path there, but for probably 83, 84, 85% of our students, they're going to have the option, if they don't score a 3 or a 4, meet or exceed standards in third grade, they're going to have to either go to the summer school program or do tutoring. Or if they score in the below, they're going to have to do both.
So what if they refuse to do either?
Then they're retained in third grade.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. Mr. Gregory?
We're all interested in the money part. And at 50% or 45% of our third graders have to have some type of intervention, then you're talking about going from 13 to maybe as much as 14, an extra year of some type of intervention, or a year, or repeating a year.
Yeah, and the problem is that the research shows that retaining kids doesn't really help them learn. Occasionally it does, but usually that's maturity. It's not being behind academically.
If I'm not mistaken, the research shows, of course, we all live by the test. It would improve a student's test score probably for 1 or 2 years. But after that, it leveled. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. And I think that part of what you said too is it's a lot of pressure to put on a third grader and a third grade teacher to have that much high stakes on a test that's fundamentally, it's supposed to be a temperature check or a photograph to see where our kids are, so that we can provide more support for them. It's a lot of pressure on a third grader.
And the 2 biggest jumps probably in public school is going from 2nd grade to 3rd grade, and from 6th grade to 7th grade. Is that correct?
Either that or 5th grade to 6th grade, because the way our schools are constructed now. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Gregory. Ms. Brown?
Here's where the rub comes, because I've been in a lot of schools and been through this repeatedly. It's not like high school or middle school. You fail this subject, you do it, You have a kid who's come in, they've retained him in the 1st grade because, say, he's crawling on the floor. He just isn't ready to be there. So then you pop up, give him the test, and the child's already a year older. And if they refuse to take the summer scholars and the tutoring, what are you going to do then?
By law, we have to retain them. Unless, now I will say, like if they've already been retained, you can't retain, it's in the law also. A child that's already been retained can't be retained again.
I know, so.
Yeah. Yeah, yes ma'am.
So, what I understand, there's 17 other states that, or maybe more than that now, but I think what I read this morning was there are about 17 other states that have a 3rd grade retention law like what Tennessee has enacted, except for the fact that all of those other states that I read, and I didn't read every law, but I read synopsis of every law.
I can barely hear.
I said most of the other states that I read about this law, there is other exceptions. In other words, for example, Florida has it as if the student is proficient through a student portfolio of other curriculum, they let that count. Georgia, teachers can appeal or parents can appeal, and they go with that. Indiana has the same way, where the teacher can say, hey, this student, yes, made poorly on this test, but I've had the student in the classroom all year, and I feel that the child is proficient in ELA to be promoted to 4th grade without any remediation. Tennessee is the only state that has passed it where it's simply based on this on the test outcome and no other outside of these 2 remediation options. And again, kind of to piggyback off Ms. Hawkins, the word on the street is that the kids that are in this 1 and 2 level, it's not, it's like they can't read, and the kids that are in the 3 and 4 can read, and that's not what this test is saying. This test is saying, hey, these kids will eventually make a 18, 19, 20 on the ACT, not can't read. Is that correct?
Yes, I think, like, I understand, like, you know, we can't accept not having kids learn to read in elementary school. Like, that's again, like, we need kids reading at higher levels and higher proficiency. Like, I'm totally on board on kids needing to be able to read by the time they leave elementary school. But at the same time, you know, I think we have to accept that a test on one day, while important, may not be the only indicator that we need to look at, because as you mentioned, other states have it. Tennessee has always had a 3rd grade retention law on the books, but it used to be a lot more similar to those other states. And even if you look at the state board policy for this and look back in it, they have mention of individual learning plans. So if, you know, like what we're supposed to do on any child of any age, you know, K through 8 that we retain, we have to put together an individual learning plan, meet with the parents, sit down, set goals, talk about what the school's going to do, what the parents going to do, everything on the table. Like, let's talk about what we can do to help this child learn. That's already in the law and on the books. It's just added this extra. So I think it's important to say, like, I think the flip side of what Ms. Hawkins said is that it's not just a one-time thing, but it's also like we already have good policy in place to help us make decisions that benefit children. We just need to be able to, you know, like maybe look at growth measures, because, you know, we've had some kids that came in through no fault of their own. You know, they came from New York or California or state or large city where the schools were closed for extended periods of time, and they've just missed, you know, 6 to 8 months of a foundational reading time. You don't overcome that in a month or two. That's going to take a year or two, and we need, you know, if we can show growth and progress. Now, it mentions in there adequate progress, adequate growth. If we could have some flexibility there to look at, you know, like what was their TBOS growth number? You know, if you look at most of our schools, you know, we were 5s in growth, which shows that our teachers and our students are growing. We just may need the time to be able to get those kids, you know, our children where they need to be. I don't know if that, Michelle, I guess, did that get at what you were?
Yeah, that's basically. I mean, I'm not against the law at all. I think it has good intentions. I just think there needs to be some added language. You know, I don't like the fact that the state has the sole discretion based on one test.
Right.
I don't like the teacher and the parent, you know, and the local school having zero say in the final outcome.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the language and the rest of it is talking about, like with the reading screeners, is encouraging that process of a dynamic process between parent and teacher and school to meet and talk, you know, so that parents know where their children are, what they need, you know, what can we do at home, what are we going to do at school, what interventions are we going to put in place. That's the right measure, I think.
Yeah, using the test or the outcome of the test as an identifier is a sound idea. It's just the strictness of, hey, you're either getting promoted or you're getting retained based on the outcome of this test. I just have some problems there.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. Mr. King?
Yeah, just looking at the law, it does seem to allow for some kind of appeal process, but it's pretty hard to really gather it's pretty vague on there. So
Yeah.
I don't know from this what that appeal process would entail. But it also, I mean, I'm also looking at this, and if a student, once they're promoted to fourth grade, they have to show adequate growth on the fourth grade ELA portion of the TCAP test before they can be promoted to fifth grade. So it's like, on one hand, it's a third grade retention, but then it's also a fourth grade retention. And at what point do we, what point does that stop? And at what, so it just leaves me uneasy thinking about that and putting all that pressure on a child. I understand the intent of this. Third grade is a pivotal year. Kids are moving from learning to read to reading to learn, and they're no longer decoding text. They're no longer using sight words. They're moving from fiction to nonfiction, learning to analyze text, things of a more advanced nature. And I think it's crucial that we come up with something. But I understand the intent of why they want to really stress the importance of third grade. And I was reading some research studies show that students that aren't on grade level, they're not proficient by the time they're at third grade, they have a greater chance, higher risk of dropping out of school, living in poverty, lower earnings, and a higher risk for just things like depression and mental illness. And so these are big concerns that I have. I think I've also looked at some other research that suggests that interventions prior to third grade seem to be successful. Interventions beyond third grade are more difficult. I saw one study where 8% of students that were not proficient, only 8% of them caught up by eighth grade. And so when I hear that there's 64% of students in the state that are not proficient, it breaks my heart, because that is, that's going to be a lost generation. They're just not going to have the skills. And so for me, I really feel that something needs to be done. I feel like there needs to be, it's not just, these things are not just important, they're crucial.
Right.
That we do something. However, I don't think we've hit the nail on the head with this retention law. I think it creates more problems than it does solutions. We were talking a minute ago about just staffing issues. How are we going to fulfill those things logistically? So I think the intent is there, and I think they're on the right track in terms of their concern. I feel like they just haven't found the right solution yet.
Yeah, and Mr. King, I think you hit on a good point. I need to reiterate, it's that K2, it's not just you don't solve a third grade issue in third grade. That K2 intervention is pivotal. And I mean, from the moment they walk into kindergarten, we're trying to figure out exactly where they are so we can help them. I just, and I agree. There's nothing more important that we do than teach kids how to read by the end of third grade, or definitely by the end of fifth grade.
Yeah, and I think we need to make an all-out effort to reach those kids. And you were saying we've got about 1,200, give or take. I'm reminded of the parable of the lost sheep. There was the 99. The shepherd went out to find that one. I feel like we need to go after those students. Maybe on the local level. Definitely on the local level, because these kids at the state level, they're just numbers on a spreadsheet. But at the local level, these are teachers, parents, administrators, principals. That they have a relationship with the child. They have an intimate knowledge of that child, and I feel like that's where we have to attack this and really go after those kids. Otherwise, we're leaving them behind. And so while I think there's a strong, I understand there's a crisis here, but of kids learning to read, but I feel like we need I think we need to find a better solution.
Yes, sir.
So.
I agree.
Thank you, Mr. King. Ms. Hawkins?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of dovetail off that in that I'm curious when a third grader takes this test, and certainly this is not the first time that everyone discovers that this child is not proficient in reading. Is there a way that we are looking at students all along, and as they're developing, getting up to this ominous wall, to know whether or not they need intervention before third grade? And my second part of that question is, I know that in child development, there are certain ages where there are certain learning windows that are open, and then they open and close. I know young children learn foreign language much better than me because that window's kind of closed. But are we at the end of third grade? Is the horse out of the barn already, or is there something we should be doing sooner?
Yeah, I think, Ms. Hawkins, I mean, it really is the key. So what we do currently now is we look at, and I've got my team back here, so y'all jump in if I'm incorrect. But so kindergarten, first, second grade, we screen 3 times a year for reading comprehension, or to see if there's a reading deficit. Like in kindergarten, our main point is to not rush putting kids in an intervention, because sometimes the child doesn't need an intervention. The child's a kindergartner, and especially the last couple of years where we've had kids come in that haven't been exposed to a lot of the things that typically kindergartners have been in terms of daycare, preschool, things like that, because of COVID closures in those entities. But so we're trying to identify as early as we can, and honestly, like our classroom teachers know almost immediately when a child is behind, and they identify at their school. Like they'll say, I think this child needs some help. So our teachers do an outstanding job, but then what we're trying to do is get data that we can use to help support and make good decisions across. So we've got a dashboard now where we'll be able to look at that screener data, kindergarten through second grade, every time we give the screener, in addition to the communication with parents. We're going to do in the spring, for the first time, we're going to do a benchmark. We do not want this to be high stakes accountability. We don't want to really push that down too early, but we do want to get a picture at the end of second grade where our kids are, so that when they come back in for third grade, we know exact areas where we can pinpoint to know exactly where they need help. Because things like the TN Ready test is more than just your basic ability to read. There's a lot of comprehension. There's grammar. There are other types of skills that they need, that we need to know where those, so that what our teachers are great at is once they discover a weakness or a hole or a gap, they're able to fill it. It's also good because a lot of times, like if you look at your average Sumner County student, our teachers generally in kindergarten resolve a lot of those needs. The thing is like we've got a lot of kids moving in first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, and they're coming from all over the country and world. And so having to step back and have the tools there for teachers to be able to very quickly assess what our kids need. So it's something that we're doing. It's just something that we can always do. We learn as we go, and we're learning a lot about how to teach children to read.
I just want to acknowledge that I realize that these past couple of years have caused some skewing of the numbers because of children not having the same access to intervention because of COVID and because of all the other things going on, and because of the great influx of people moving into our area. So I realize that probably has caused the numbers to be what they are. Do we anticipate those numbers to be like that in, say, 3 years?
I would hope not.
Yeah, I do too. I'm just wondering how much of these numbers reflect kind of a mass migration, it seems like last year.
Yeah, I think that, realize that our kids have been less affected. If you look at the national scores, there's 2 decades of growth on the NAEP assessment for 9-year-olds. So that's a substantial loss. we're within a couple points in third grade, and we're higher in fourth and fifth grade than we were in 2019. Now, I think, though, that said, the thing is like if we can really dig in and work, especially in some of our subgroups, we can really move the needle for a lot of kids. And that's what our goal is to take, we've got the tools and we've got the teachers and we've got the ability to support them. The thing now is to really drill down and have as one of our main foci is, reading is one of the most important things. And you mentioned earlier, it's still an important thing. It's not impossible to teach a child to read when they're older. It's just hard because, for instance, if you look at our EL performance, we did great in elementary and middle school. High school, it's a little bit more of a challenge because what we're seeing is we're getting a lot of kids that are moving in and they're 16 and they've had no formal education in 3 or 4 years, and they're sometimes illiterate in their native language. So it's not just that they have a reading deficit, they have a whole lot of deficits. And that's why it's such a challenge in high school, because if it slips that long, there's not just one need or concern, there are a whole bunch of needs and concerns.
Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Chairman Brewer. I'll sit over here with my back to you. So a lot of these points and things have been said, questions and comments. We all agree that we want our children to read. We all agree, and we work hard at that. And I'm very grateful for our educators and those kindergarten through third years. As a former elementary preschool teacher, they are extremely important that these children get these skills. And Foundations is phenomenal. I've been in the classrooms, I see the kids, they're engaged, they're excited. The teachers just drop them in their little sponges. So, it's fun. It's fun to learn. And this is what we want. I think we do a great job in this county. And we've already been addressing a lot of these things. Your eyes are always watching and making sure, the teacher in the classroom, to the principal, the lead educators, you're watching for those times that you know that this child needs intervention. How many years ago we did RTI? It was used for a while. And we saw great gains bringing these children back to a acceptable or a reading level that we knew that they could do. This all seems so punitive to me. Did they communicate at all from the State Department of Education or the lawmakers? Did they discuss with our district leadership, with our chief academic officers across the state? Did they ask about the way to do this that doesn't come across punitive?
I think, when they were passing this law, I think they were looking at the crisis. At that point, we didn't have any hard data on what was going to happen, but there were some groups, and I can't think of the name of the group, I think it was NWEA, it's a national educational group. They did a pilot study to try to measure COVID learning loss. Now, it turns out nationwide they were pretty close to accurate about what happened, but that was with another 18 months of closures. School districts that stayed open, like we did, have not seen that precipitous drop. So, it's a little bit more, but I think when the legislature considered this, there were a lot of concerns that a significant number of school districts in Tennessee and across the country were not going to come back into school. And you can't teach kids how to, it is exceedingly difficult to teach kids how to read on Zoom. When we had it that first year, I think one of our principals described the kindergarten class as like watching bats fly out of a cave. And, it's just hard to keep attention and to do the things. It's hard, in districts that are still requiring masks. It's hard to teach kids phonics when your face is covered and they can't see your lips and mouth and how words are formed. So, we did the right thing, but I think I understand where our state leaders were is realizing the crisis that was coming and trying to get the attention of everybody to address it. I don't think, knowing our legislators, I don't think that there was a necessary, that this was punitive. I think it was trying to say what's best for kids. And then, us looking on the, now that it's coming to fruition, looking at it and saying, this doesn't really capture what we need to do what's best for kids. We're going to need some help to make this less punitive and more beneficial for kids.
So because Davidson County and Shelby and Memphis didn't go to school, so we all have to fall under the state's
I'm going to let Dr.
plan.
Phillips take that one.
So this is what,
Thanks.
and I'm not the only one I know that has gotten phone calls and emails from parents that are engaged, that keep up on what's going on. And they've already got children that, I mean, they're struggling with anxiety and with tests. And this is like going to send this child over the edge. Then there were multiple emails and phone calls from parents. So do you want to answer that?
Well, I don't know that I'm going to answer that, but I will make a comment that our delegation at the legislature do a phenomenal job talking with me, especially when the session is occurring. This was done in an extraordinary session, and often you see those bills get adjusted in the next regular session because there's not as much time in those extraordinary sessions to have discussion and get feedback. So I would hope that we have an opportunity for some input and maybe some changes. And I think what this board's talking about and other boards are talking about will be helpful for that discussion. I think Mr. Lancaster and Mr. King both, and some others may have mentioned, often there are unintended consequences in some of this legislation that was really rooted in good intentions, but it takes more than one bite at the apple to get it right. And hopefully that's what we're seeing here. And for those of us that have been around and watched legislation over time, this won't be the first one that follows that format, nor will it be the last one. But hopefully these types of discussions will make them aware that parents have concerns, educators have concerns, and boards have concerns, and that we find some flexibility in a way to make it effective and not punitive.
And I think, to just piggyback off that a little bit, I think that it's also important to keep what they got right, because Tennessee has a literacy model now that's the envy of the nation in terms of, I mean, a lot of universities across the country are fighting foundational literacy. Like I was on a call and it said that California has 1,100 school districts and they only have foundational literacy in about 4 in a comprehensive manner, where every Tennessee district now has that. So, you know, they got a lot of things really, really right. They're going to help our kids for a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Langford, Dr. Phillips. My last part to this question. The first thing, when you read through the law, first thing I think about is money. It all comes down to money. What's the state's plan on funding these tutors, this extra staffing, the summer learning programs, the buses that are run? So how are they going to do that to the districts?
So the law allocated money for the learning, the summer scholars. So the money's there. They would have to act, the legislature would have to vote to provide transportation. That's been a separate grant, but they've done that each year. You know, we were able to provide buses all summer this year. What is not included in it, the money for tutoring has come out of ESSER. So as long, you know, while we have, you know, we've set aside a significant amount to cover tutoring. So as long as we have the ESSER money for another, 18 months or so, we've got tutoring money, but the bill does not include tutoring money in there.
And my concern about that is funding. Those specific pots of funding are not recurring. So we're going to have legislation that has no sunset provision, but funding that does. Does that make sense? So, while you may be able to manage that financially 1 year, it doesn't necessarily mean that when we're living with this 3 years from now, you will have that same funding source. So I think that's a concern. Anytime you have legislation at the state level, they attach a fiscal note to it that's supposed to show what costs are out there. And I don't really think that this particular legislation has an accurate fiscal note, considering it's going to be a law that's going to impact multiple years from now on out.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes, Dr. Phillips, and now Ms. Andrews.
Yeah, so I feel like we've done a lot of talking as far as what we're doing on the district level and what our responsibilities are and so forth. But with this, what's the responsibility of the state? I would say year after year, for pretty much as long as I can remember at this point, we've had a failed test. So we're going to put this one test on the backs of third graders, which are what, 8-year-olds, that to retain them. I mean, that's a huge pressure on them. It's a huge pressure on their teachers. Psychologically, as Ms. Hayes pointed out, you see more and more kids nowadays with anxiety and so forth. So where is the responsibility on the state to say, if they're going to put this type of burden on our teachers and our students, where's their accountability to give us a test that's not flawed? Is that a question? And then also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this has happened year over year, that if we're giving the test on Tuesday and we enroll a student on Monday, they're still expected to take the test on Tuesday. So how do we look at that type of data, and how fair is that for a kid that is coming from another state that, is maybe doing things differently? If they then take, our test and they don't score well, they're being, that's just a lot of change within a student.
That child would not count. That wouldn't count. You have to have a certain number of days. They have to take the test, but in terms of the accountability piece, it wouldn't kick in because they have to have a certain number of days in the system.
Is that already part of current state law?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that their scores don't actually count towards. Okay.
They would still take the test, but it wouldn't count in the same way.
Okay. But there's no accountability that's built in within the state that they're saying, if we're going to put this type of burden on our teachers and our students, then we are going to ensure that we're going to do our part. Because the other part is I feel like when we're talking about ELA, and just the more and more I hear about it, is that some of this is not that students can't read, but they have a legit learning disability that sometimes hasn't been recognized yet, whether it's dyslexia or whatever. So where is the state looking at those as well to say, hey, we're going to fund that type of intervention? Because it may not be that it's the manner of not being able to read, but when you're doing a timed test and the pressures of that.
I will say that the other good part about foundational literacy is it helps us diagnose things like dyslexia quicker. There's a lot of emphasis now at the state level and at the local level about identifying students that have learning disabilities or dyslexia, and then providing support. Like that's come in the last 3 to 5 years, that's come a long way. There's actually, it's part of the new funding formula with TISA is dyslexic students and meeting their needs. So I would say that that's actually an area where there's more support than we've had historically.
Okay. I just feel like that's fair to our students, that if we're going to put this type of pressure on them, we need to be absolutely making sure. And I'm not just saying that at the local level, but that's statewide.
Yeah.
That's just.
Yeah, I think what we have for the first time is the ability to be able to more accurately figure out what's going on when a child can't learn to read, and to be able to help get them the tools and resources that they need. So that's a huge plus. Like you don't find some of those learning disabilities without foundational literacy.
Correct. I think that's why I think so many of us agree that it's not the matter of whether or not we want students to read. I think the overwhelming issue that we have is the amount that we are putting on one test. That's 1 to 2, 3 days. I think a couple of years ago of our neighboring county, which granted I don't think we did the test that year because that was COVID year, but Wilson County, early March, they lost 2 schools and a lot of kids lost their homes. Had we not had COVID, they would have had to take the test. Who knows how those kids would have scored? And if they had scored poorly, then they would have also then, in addition to losing all of that, also been looked at possibly being retained.
I will say, and I don't want to come across as a defender here, but I will say if you read the appeals process at the end of the law, the the commissioner can set aside those, like if there's, it specifically says if there's a natural disaster or something like that. That
Right, but I mean, that's a large that we can see. But in every kid's life, I mean, in
Sure.
any given kid's life, you don't know, you know,
right.
their parent passed away that week, if their dog passed away the day before, if they didn't make the team that they wanted to make,
Which
or
is
whatever
where I
it may
think
be.
I think that the language that's even earlier in the rules and regulations from the state board is a process for the school and parents to sit down and discern through a whole list of indicators what's best for that child. And, you know, the test score being one of it, but also, you know, a whole host of other factors. That
Well,
they
I
can
understand
look
the
at.
test score is like the first, and then if they don't do well on it, then we can jump through a bunch of hoops to make sure.
No,
then-
what I'm saying is if you take that part out,
Okay.
the earlier part of the rules has like what we're talking about, which is crafting a solution individually for a child that needs help, you know, to figure out what's best for them in terms of whether it's retention or not, or if they progress on, the kind of supports that they're going to need to be successful in the next grade.
Like I said, I think everybody agrees we want our students reading and growing, and you know, we support our teachers. They're doing an incredible work, but it is definitely frustrating to have a law, as Ms. Hayes mentioned, you know, that is this punitive on our students and our teachers, because it really does affect both of them.
Thank you, Ms. Andrews. Ms. Brown?
My main concern has always been we have a test on 1 to 4 days. Most people do it 3 or 4. And yet we never give the respect to the teacher on these questionable ones. They have been with them 185 days. So the teacher, I think, should be allowed to say what they need to say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the smartest kid in the world can goof up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I wish we'd ask for that.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. King?
Yeah, so I'm old enough to remember a few years back when they tried to roll out TN Ready, and the thing was just a complete disaster. And so, you know, to put all the weight on this one test, I'm, you know, don't underestimate the ability of the government to screw things up, right? Of course, that quote gets thrown around in various circles, but I just don't have confidence that, you know, they're going to have what's going to happen if they roll out the test and there are problems, a server goes down or something, whatever, and then they got to go to paper and pencil. It's really a mess. And I remember one year, as I recall, the test scores weren't even they didn't even count them, right? So let's say something of that kind of level of disaster strikes, and what's going to happen to those students? Mm-hmm. You know, because all of this is riding on that one test, and it just seems like there's a tremendous amount of risk there. You know, so that's a concern of mine. Do we automatically just send them on without any intervention? And so to put all our eggs into one basket, to really just put all our faith in one exam, one day, that, you know, one test that occurs on one day or 2 days or 3 days, you know, that child could be going through some personal things at home. You know, what if their parents are going through a divorce? What if there's some serious psychological trauma going on, and they just show up for the test and it's just not gonna work for them. You know, and not to mention what I just previously said was that what if there's some kind of catastrophic rollout problem with the exam? It just makes me very uneasy. Yeah. And what would happen to those students?
Yeah, we try to use our benchmarking because we get it back. So we give a benchmark that simulates the TN Ready test in elementary, mm-hmm. and we get those results back. We do it paper and pencil to mirror what the students will receive, but we get those results back usually within a week, and it's pretty accurate. So we use that data as much as we use the TN Ready because we get it early, late December, early or late February, since we do it twice, and we've got pretty good data to look at to give us a snapshot of where our kids are. But I think, again, it's like that's using it as a process to assess what's best for the kid, not to try to use it as an accountability measure, but just to say, so the good thing is we would have, in the event that happened, we would have data to fall back on. Thankfully we took it in 2020, right before COVID hit, and so we had our scores back for that year to be able to kind of measure where we were. So we use that a lot in tandem with the TN Ready, because typically by the time we get to TN Ready data, it's mid-July, early to mid-July before we get it anyway. So its effectiveness is limited in what we do with it.
Thank you, Mr. King. Mr. Gregory?
And all this comes at a real difficult time for the whole United States because we have such a teacher shortage. And I'm hearing that on the news, not only in Tennessee, but throughout our country. I don't know, I'm not sure if it's 50 states, but and you may be aware of how many states are or are not. But we have a teacher shortage, the worst that I can remember since I started school. And that's been a lot of years. I think, I'm not sure, but I think we have the Sunday schools in the Portland area that do not have teachers yet.
We're pretty close. We
Pretty
had to add
close.
some growth positions.
But have anybody applied? I mean, that's the issue. It's not the fact that they can't hire them; they just don't have them to. They just don't have the people who have applied. The way I understand it, and I'm sure it's true more than just Portland school. But there are some schools that lost enough enrollment that they lost a teacher. I know that.
We've been pretty fortunate. We're in pretty good shape. We're in real good shape.
Thank you, Mr. Gregory. Ms. Hawkins?
Just in listening to this whole discussion about this new law, I kind of take a big step back and look at the whole big picture. And I realize that, this isn't the first year that students will be in a situation where they have the possibility of being retained. That's been something that can happen any year to any student if they don't perform. But it's been the decision of the teacher. And so I think what is different about this is that the government is making the decision. And if I were a teacher who had worked hard to get a degree, possibly a master's, possibly a doctorate, for this kind of thing to come down and say, we don't trust you, we're going to make this decision for you, I would take that as a slap in the face of my professional capabilities. And I think I'm getting that feeling, is that teachers have always had this power to make these decisions, and now someone else is coming along and saying, we don't trust you to make the right decision, so we're going to do it for you, and we're going to ball it all up in this one test. This is going to be the decider, and we're going to be the ones to set those standards, and we're not going to let you as a teacher have a say. Just my own personal observation from hearing this discussion.
Yeah, I would echo Ms. Hawkins' point, but I think our teachers felt like they get slapped in the face a whole lot more than just this, based on some of the things the state's passed down over the last couple of years regarding testing and some of the other things. But that being said, when I look at this this law, to me what it looks like is the state identified a problem and they came up with a one-size-fits-all solution. And so what they did in doing that is they didn't take into account the student and their situation. They didn't take into account any circumstances around that student, like I think Mr. King, Mr. Lancaster, and Ms. Andrews have said, divorce, a pet dies. We just lost a dog recently, and that was pretty traumatic for our kids. So all these other things, they don't take the teacher's input, they don't take in the school's input, they don't take in the district's input, and they've just said, we're lumping you all together. I think as a county, we probably do a better job than most if not every district in the state when it comes to trying to identify where learning gaps are for our students, not just when it comes to, ELA, but whether it be math, whether it be science, whether it be all these other areas that we're trying to work with them in. And I feel like, when trying to solve this problem, the solution isn't to say if you don't get a certain score on this test, the solution is we have a problem with students being able to read. Let's put money into fixing the problem before they get into third grade, whether that be tutoring or intervention programs or providing the benchmark assessments to every district at certain levels throughout the school year and at different grades, so that these students don't show up one day and suddenly, based on the results of one test, they're being judged. There are a lot of other things, whether it be through pre-K, whether it be through tutoring programs or interventions that happen before third grade. And I think as a county, we do a really good job of doing that. But even with that, we're looking at what 1/3, 1/4 of all of our third grade students that now would have to go through a summer scholars program or a tutoring program because they don't meet a certain number from a test on one day. And I think that's the biggest challenge with this. It's not that there doesn't need to be a solution or there's not a solution, but I think their approach to that solution causes more challenges down the road than it does actually help the students improve what they're trying to help them improve at, and that's their reading literacy level.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. We have talked a whole lot about this thing this evening and learned a whole lot about it. Let me suggest, without objection from any of the board members, why don't we ask staff to draw up a resolution with our concerns about it to send to the state and have it for the next board meeting. Would that work, Mr. Johnson, Dr. Phillips? Any objection to that? Let's take a look at that, and they'll send it to us in advance. If there's things that we need to tweak on it, we can in between now and the next meeting. And that way we can send something over there with our concerns to the state and let our voice be heard as well. Do you have anything else, Mr.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? All minds clear. All right. Well, thank you all very much. We are adjourned.